diplomatic affairs editor, The Hindu, to be in conversation with Mr. Nasheed. Maldives in crisis.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us, because the post-lunch session is always the most difficult one, but we have endeavored to keep one of our most exciting speakers at the Huddle for you in this session. Journalists are used to going to the news, so it's a rare miracle when the news comes to us. We had, of course, invited President Nasheed many months ago, but the fact is that today he is poised at a very important moment, not just for the Maldives, but for South Asia and India as well. The last few weeks have seen Maldives go, lunge from one sort of sense of a crisis to another, a constitutional crisis, a military crisis, a crisis, it would seem, that has brought India and China nearly head to head. And the question is this crisis in Maldives an inflection point? Is this going to change things, or are we just going to get used to the new normal in the Maldives as it is today? Our guest, in fact, has been, you've had an appetizer of his views earlier today, and he has been introduced. But I want to put in perspective just how unique his career has been. He was barely 30 when he was in prison. He, against then President Gayoom, when he fought against him, when he was a dissident lawyer, an activist, an environmental activist, where very few people in those days even spoke about climate change. He was barely 40 when he became the Maldives' first elected president, and elected in a multi-party election. He was also the first to hold a cabinet meeting underwater, and came into the fore. But from that point, where in the 1930s he was already being called the Mandela of the Maldives, to being president, to losing that. And today we see Mr. Nasheed doing exactly what he was doing 20 years ago, but perhaps not able to do it from the streets of Male itself. Where are we today when it comes to the Maldives crisis? Many would say, India lived through 30 years of President Gayoom, and maybe we can just live through more of this sort of situation in the Maldives. Why do you think this crisis is going to be different, President Nasheed?
Thank you very much. Can I just for 7-8 minutes
Sure.
Talk about the crisis in the Maldives? And can I
You
use
want to use the podium, please?
It's easier. Good afternoon. In 2012, I was deposed in a coup. Our government was the first democratically elected government in the Maldives. We received multi-party politics in 2008. Since then, we've seen a stolen election. President Yamin has come to power. He has purged his own party, initially arresting his defense minister, Colonel Nazim. Then he arrested every single opposition leader, including myself, Sheikh Imran from the Adalat party, Honorable Qasim Ibrahim from the Jamhuri party, and every single other major politician he has arrested. He did not stop there. He fell apart with his brother, President Mohamed Abdul Gayoom, and then he has now arrested President Mohamed Abdul Gayoom. He has dismantled the Supreme Court. He has arrested the Chief Justice and other senior judges. He has got the military to occupy the parliament, and he has announced martial law, and he has effectively overrun the state. As I speak here today, more of our people are being beaten up. Almost all our journalists, after last night's events, are in intensive care in hospital. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is that a crisis? With your liberal society, with your good books, good food, with your films, you would of course see that as a crisis. But believe me, we have been dished this menu for the last so many hundreds of years. So why is it a crisis now? This was never pictured as a crisis. The real crisis in the Maldives, in my mind, springs from two developments. One is land grab, the other is the state within the state of the Maldives by the ISIS. Now, attempts, before I go into what I mean by land grab, please understand, during the last 40 years, Saudi Arabia has propagated a very narrow version of Islam in the Maldives. That has created a breeding ground for jihadist movements. We are now in this very unfortunate situation, where the Maldives is the highest per capita for any nation of people who are fighting for the ISIS. You cannot do that without a very impressive network at home. Radical ISIS has embedded themselves in strategic positions of our state. Not just security forces, but immigration, customs, and so on. It becomes a crisis at this moment because the ISIS is being flushed out of Syria and the Levant. And they are coming back home. We must stop it, and we must find solutions to it. So, in my view, the crisis in the Maldives, the first crisis in the Maldives is the state within the state. And also, I think there is a far more sophisticated attack on the Maldives happening without a single shot being fired. In recent years, there has been a global rush for land in developing countries, which is currently taking place at a scale unprecedented since the colonial era. Although land grabs are occurring worldwide, they are more common in countries where the protection of human rights is poor. Due to a combination of international and domestic drivers, the Maldives has become a flourishing land grab paradise. Motivation of countries that pursue land grabs and the regimes that allow their land to be acquired by foreign powers are well understood. Emerging powers' desire for food and energy security, investments opportunities, and their geopolitical ambitions are the external drivers of these land grabs. Local drivers are the desire for autocratic rulers to consolidate and strengthen their power, and more importantly, the autocrats need to line their pockets. The relationship between authoritarian states and the propensity of their governments to permit land grabs are amazing. The standard prescription for this is change state type to autocracy. First, do that. Dismantle transparency and democratic oversight. Acquire infrastructure projects, very often vanity projects, roads that lead to nowhere, bridges that don't bridge. And also the prices of these projects are often extremely inflated and financed through commercial loans or supplier credit. The receiving country, therefore, cannot pay back the debt, and the debt is used as a disciplining regime which of course is your classical debt trap. When countries can't pay back the debt, they ask for equity and we end up relinquishing our sovereignty. I'm afraid without firing a single shot, China has grabbed more land than the East India Company had at the height of the colonial era. But of course, they have weaponized foreign direct investments. Instead of rifles, the weapons in the colonial arsenal today are bribery, corruption, and dubious investments. I don't have anything against foreign direct investments. I come from a center-right political view. We want trade, we want investments. But there is a process that must be followed. There should be open tenders, competitive bidding, and democratic oversight. But when deals are done in the dark with despots, and land is sold off without public knowledge, that leaves the country in debt to a foreign power for generations. Then when this happens, it's not foreign direct investments, it is not economics, it is politics, and it is land grab. This year, we are due to have presidential elections in the Maldives. These elections are about so much more than democracy. These elections are so much more than human rights. They are about so much more than the plight of our country, my country, the Maldives. There is trouble in the Maldives, and I believe that this is of grave importance to the Indian Ocean. It just doesn't affect only the Maldives. What is happening in the Maldives will have an impact, will have an effect on everyone in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you so much, and thank you for setting out the challenges ahead of your country. But I do have to ask, most would say you were president for 4 years. In fact, as the gentleman asked this morning, you actually set up the first Chinese mission in Male, something that didn't go down very well because New Delhi felt blindsided at the time. You saw the radicalization, if you like, of your youth before ISIS was even a credible threat. Why didn't you do anything about it?
In 2007, President Gayoom visited China. And before that visit, appointed an ambassador. And in 2008, we had already started a high commission, an embassy in China. This was before I came to government. And then in our government, I had no other choice other than allowing that. In media here in India, seems to be a trust deficit where there is a view that we were also drivers, we were also facilitating exactly the issues that I am mentioning. For instance, for your question, by establishing a Chinese embassy in the Maldives, are we not also driving what I call land grab drivers? Are we also not driving that? No, we had already, the process had already started, and therefore there was not much we could do about it. And also, there was the issue of clarity. In 2009, I went to Copenhagen Summit, and there I was able to interact with both the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese Premier. What I saw there was that they were very close together. And in fact, until very recently, we didn't quite understand what India was looking at. We were not sure if India would not join the Silk Route. So there was an issue of clarity, but in terms of, for your question on why did we open the Chinese embassy in the Maldives during our government? My answer is we didn't. And also on, was there anything that we could do on ISIS? Well, as I mentioned, it has been 40 years since this very narrow version of Islam has been propagated in the Maldives. And by the time we came in, there was a fair amount of freedom of expression, and this was what we were going for. My view has always been, and still is, that we must allow them to speak. And it is only that, through that, we will be able to engage with them. If we do not give them freedom of expression, they will go underground and we would not understand what is going on. So again, I would say there was not a lot that we could do.
All right. I do want to speak a little bit about your tenure itself, because we were there during the SAARC summit in 2010 that followed shortly after. There was a moment that just before the summit began, when certain groups went and covered up, I think, statues that had been donated by India and by the other SAARC countries to the Maldives, sort of, radical Islamists saying this was against the religion. Your reaction to that was to have a judge detained. Do you think that one action was what led to everything else? Do you think if you could go back in time and change that action? Because eventually, the accusation against you is that when you were in power, you did exactly what others in power have done.
Well, that is true. Power has this sense of continuity. A leader coming in, and especially after so many years of single-party autocratic rule, you can topple a dictator, but it's very, very difficult to uproot a dictatorship. Yes, if I can go back in time, I would not have done that. We would probably try to understand this a little bit better. But also, if I can go back in time, I would also, again, ask for a lot of assistance in capacity from our neighbors. We were very young. We were very young in democracy. Our political party is only 12 years old. And we came into government on that platform. And it wasn't easy. Yes, I would have done otherwise.
All right. I do want to come to India's role in all of this, but since you've mentioned China and you've spoken about the land grab, this is also a running theme. We've seen it in Sri Lanka. We've seen it even in Bangladesh. We may see it in Nepal. And we certainly are seeing it in the Maldives, where the opposition tends to question all of these arrangements. The Hulumale Island development, which China is undertaking, or the Friendship Bridge, which I think was renamed, but originally was called the Maldives-China Friendship Bridge, and now it's just called the Hulumale Bridge. These are developments that any society should welcome and does welcome. However, what tends to happen is that the opposition says it's China that's coming in and doing these things, yet when they come to power, they repeat all of the development projects. We've seen in Sri Lanka, the current government has actually taken more loans from China and is not repaying the debt that they claim had crippled them in the first place. Why do you think that countries in South Asia have become particularly vulnerable to this? And do you think it's a cycle that can't be stopped?
Well, once you sign a sovereign contract, it's difficult to get out of it. You have to abide by it. My issue with the bridge is when we were in government, we asked for a price for the bridge from a number of Indian companies, and they gave us a price of $77 million. President Yamin is building it for $250 million. And also much of these projects are through supplier credit or Exim Bank finance, and they are commercial projects. So you not only inflate the price of the project, but you are also taking the money on commercial terms. And therefore, it's just not possible to pay it back. And when you can't pay back the loan, they ask for equity. So in the process, we relinquish sovereignty. why have other countries, or why have countries not being able to reverse this situation?
Well, Sri Lanka and Hambantota, of course, it's 80% now owned by China.
Well, I think as long as we try to look at this issue through the WTO framework or foreign direct investments framework, then it would be very difficult. But if you look at it as a human rights issue, now in Hague, in the criminal court, there is now one case on land grab. So if you try to see this as a human rights, a suppression, a subjugation issue, I think we might have other outcomes. What we would like to see is all countries agreeing on foreign direct investments. That this is not your WTO framework things, but the tender process, the transparency, the democratic oversight, that has to be there if other countries are going to come up with vast sums of money for whatever reason. So I think my answer to you is perhaps we will not try to deal with this through the WTO or arbitration, trade arbitration systems, but we would see this as a human rights issue.
All right, that's certainly a very interesting point. Yet, when India stood up and said, we don't want to be a part of the Belt and Road, it was the only country that said so. And it was certainly the only country in the entire region that did not become a part of the Belt and Road, minus Bhutan, of course. And every country in the world, from the US and Japan and all the rest, sent high-level dignitaries there. So my question really is, what is it that India can do in its own region to counter this influence, which is obviously rather attractive to most of our neighbors?
I've been reading a lot about deep pockets, that India doesn't have this kind of money, China has a lot of money, and so on. If you look at development process in the Maldives, we've become a middle-income country primarily through the State Bank of India's investments. And I don't think the people of the Maldives would forget that instantly. And certainly not the people who are getting all the loans from the State Bank of India. And I think, so therefore it's not only just a question of how deep your pocket is, but also on the process of it. Now, when you call for a tender, when you want to do something, you have to think about it, you have to look at the outcomes of it, you have to let that through all sorts of scrutinies. So I think what we would like to see more is tendering, transparency, and democratic oversight. So in that sense, India would only be the country who would be able to have more sustainable investments, sustainable development in Indian Ocean countries. What's happening in many Indian Ocean countries, or at least in the Maldives, by 2020, we would have to pay back our loans. And even now, more than 70% of our international debt is to China, and we will not be able to pay it back. Then we would have to relinquish something.
All right. You're looking to India today, not just in terms of economics, but you've certainly issued an appeal some weeks ago. On February 1st, the Maldivian courts decided to reinstate, to in fact cancel the cases against what they call political prisoners, including yourself. They also reinstated members of parliament. And the reaction to that has really been that we have seen emergency being put in the Maldives. That emergency runs out on Tuesday. Draw for us a picture of what you think is going to happen next.
One of the very grave issues for me was the arrest of President Gayoom. President Gayoom had ruled the Maldives for 30 years. And the circle in the Maldives has always been whoever comes to power arrests everyone else who was there before. We try to break away from that. there was huge pressure on our government to investigate President Gayoom. But we resisted that. We questioned President Gayoom just once, but we had no intention, and we did not arrest or we did not intimidate, harm, or do anything to the former president. So when President Gayoom was taken in by his own brother, it hit us very hard. Your question is, how long would the emergency take?
What do you see happening next, since you have made this appeal to India?
I think President Yamin is trying to get the resignation of the Chief Justice. So he will have the emergency rule as long as the Chief Justice is holding on. The family told me that the judge is strong, and I'm hopeful that he will not resign. The emergency is to get his resignation. It's not for any other reason. So I think if the judge doesn't resign, the emergency will continue.
All right. Your solution a few weeks ago was in a direct appeal to India and the international community for an Indian envoy accompanied by the military to come to the Malé. That seemed very drastic.
Well, I think, I kind of feel that we are in a defining moment in the Indian Ocean. And we must depart from the past now. I keep saying, if it was the 1820s or 30s now, and if I had talked about land grab, and again, when I started thinking about land grab, and I did a Google search on it, nothing comes up. So people are not seeing what's happening in the Indian Ocean in this context. That there is a prescription, or what I call the prescription, where how you do it. And I think this is devious, I think this is wrong, and I think we should all come together.
You actually think the state type is trying to be
So basically, to do this, you have to change the state type.
To move from democracy to a more autocratic.
Yeah, to move from democracy, you have to try to make the country more autocratic. And you can get many leaders to do that, especially if you're willing to come up with vast sums of money. And if you're willing to prop up the government, you can do that. So I think, so your question was, isn't it drastic? My answer is, I don't think it is. I think we are at a turning point, and I think if we don't see it now, it would be too late. Let's say come 2018, come August, and there is elections in the Maldives, and there are no other candidates. President Yamin himself is the candidate, and he wins it. And so the Maldives goes into at least 10 years of autocratic rule, and I don't think after that either India or any country would be in a position to pull us out from that situation. We've always seen India as a net provider of security and safety in the Indian Ocean. Not just now. For the last 600-700 years, India has consistently done that. It doesn't matter who rules India. India has always done that. So in my view, if nothing is done today, you would lose the moment.
All right, it is a very important moment, and it's a moment where we're seeing Maldives become an area of increased contestation. You've, of course, mentioned the Chinese. Not since, I think, the 17th century and Admiral Zheng He have Chinese military ships been near the Maldives as they were earlier this year. There is India, of course, which is the net provider of security. But there is also the United States, a country that could actually lose its biggest base in the region, with Mauritius and the Chagos Islands, and as a result, their Diego Garcia base in some trouble. Do you see the Maldives now becoming a sort of an area of contestations which will be buffeted by the roles India, the US, and China decide to play in this region?
Yeah, we seem to be sandwiched there in the middle. The United States, well, we see the United States looking more and more inwards. And we don't now feel that they are willing to exert their hegemony or exert their power in the Indian Ocean. They've outsourced their foreign policy to others. And I think India would be far better placed to find solutions in the Indian Ocean.
Right. What about yourself, Mr. Nasheed? In the next few months, there could be elections, as you said, in the Maldives. But you remain outside the Maldives. If you go back, you face arrest. If you stay out, do you face irrelevance?
Well, how you make yourself relevant in the last session that we spoke about, I will try to make myself, or I will keep on talking, I will keep on saying the things that I believe in. I might, hopefully I'm still very, very hopeful that we will have free and fair elections, that I will be able to take part. That candidates of political parties' choice would be able to take part in these elections, and as I told the panel before, I have a very optimistic view, and I believe that there will be free and fair elections, and I do believe that I will be able to contest, and I also do believe that I'll win it again.
Very modestly put. The question will also come, conversely, is it going to be worth the price that you've paid for this political cause? Because you now live far away from your own children. Your party is under some trouble inside Mali. Every day we see the pictures of the protests growing smaller, if I'm not mistaken. So the question is it going to be worth it to keep pushing from the outside?
It's always worth it. When it is to do with the future generations, when it is to do with younger people, and when it is to do with a vision and a will. I believe that we can salvage it, and I believe that we can come back and turn it around. And I am again saying, we've won it against the odds before. We always win it against the odds, and hopefully we will win it again.
All right. You're also in the strange position. The person who actually kept you in prison for nearly a decade is now somebody whose rights you are standing up for. If you go into elections, you will probably go into elections along with President Gayoom, although we didn't see the final, the alliance between all your parties take an official tone for the elections. The question really, is it all then down to politics? Could you deal with President Yameen at some point in the future?
No, I couldn't. President Gayoom and everyone in the Maldives, and including President Yameen, he's learning now. He's learning. We have all learned in the last 15 years what other countries probably experience in 50 years. And there is a common interest, which is multi-party politics. So when there is a common interest, when there is a commonality, I think we should work together. And I believe we can work with President Gayoom, with Honorable Qasim, and also with the Adalat Party. And we must try and stabilize the country. We must try and see how we can run a unity government for a time, for a while. And try to see that democracy is entrenched in the Maldives. That's the view, that's the idea, and that's what we are working at.
In this hypothetical situation, and I'm asking you to look into the future, you may be able to counter some of the land grab by reversing contracts or bringing deals to account. How will you reverse the ISIS threat to the Maldives?
None of these things are going to go away tomorrow. It will be a process, it will take time, and to make people more aware of what the ISIS is doing, I think we need to talk about it more, we need to educate people more on it, and rehabilitate people. So again, when I could see that this is a international issue, it is happening in many other Islamic countries.
But Maldives at one point was the highest number per capita of people joining ISIS came from the Maldives. But that's because you're a small population to start.
Yeah, but then, the fact that so many people, more than 500-600 people have left the Maldives to fight in a civil war elsewhere. And you can't do that without a very good network. Now, for instance, our people they are very seafaring people, and they go to ships abroad. It's difficult to get 500 people going abroad on ships. So if the ISIS is able to do it at home, they must have a very strong network here. So yes, they do have a network. Now, again, unfortunately, what I see is President Yamin has an understanding with the deep state. So what I call the state within the state of the Maldives. So there is a small element within, a very small element within the military and the police who is protecting him. And these people have another ideology. They have another view, they have another vision. Most of our military, most of our police are trained here. And they're good people. They're professional people. But we have changed the whole thing so that very few outrageous and radical people have taken strategic positions. Now, if you look at a big town like Mosul, and if you think, why did it fall with 20, 30 people in a pickup jeep with a few bazookas? How does the biggest town in Persia fall? Because they eat it from the inside first. They go deep, they go in, they eat it from the inside, and finally when you attack, no one is countering it. So I think, I'm very worried that this process is going on in the Maldives.
You certainly painted a very frightening picture of what is to follow. My final question to you is that we do hear, in India, there is that sort of sense of hurt that we do hear from our neighbors when they're in trouble.
Of course.
But the rest of the time, it's always about India being big brother and facing a pushback. What is the role that you see for India in this region? Because we have seen certain situations, like in Nepal a few years ago, when India tried to enforce a better constitution and faced a pushback. The blockade followed. That didn't go very well. Pakistan is a different issue, of course, but we have seen that kind of pushback at various times in Sri Lanka and, of course, in the Maldives, even when you were president. So the question really is, how do you see the India of the future in South Asia?
Well, I keep saying, I read your newspaper, and how I see it is good books, good films, good food, excellent sport. So, we see also, most importantly, India as the net provider of safety and security in the Indian Ocean. And we wouldn't like to see, I don't think we would like to see any other country militarily coming into the Indian Ocean. And yes, of course, when the times are good, you are not worried. You have a different relationship. It is when the times are bad that you are looking for India. Well, it's unfortunate that that's a human condition. When it's going good, you're not worried. And now, when it's going bad, you of course want to see your bigger neighbor coming in and sorting it out.
And has the bigger neighbor given you any indicator it might?
You see, ma'am, I don't interact so much with officials in that
But
manner.
you made a very public appeal.
Yeah, well, so my appeals are always very public.
So we should wait for a Twitter response,
Well, yeah.
as is the way in the world.
So my method, or how I try to do it, is not through intricacies and not through designs and deviousness. Find a friend, be good to a friend. Don't play that friend against someone else. So keep line and length, and you'll get that catch.
All right, you still sound very hopeful. Thanks so much. We do have some time for questions, so if anybody in the audience would like to put their hand up, Go ahead, sir. You need a mic.
How will you deal with the process of people or the person
I don't think we should go busy arresting everyone every day. We must first get our justice, get our systems organized. And, if we start running after people the minute you are in power, you end up being the same person whom you're trying to overcome. I can't say that people would not be judged and people would not be persecuted for the wrongs that they have done. Justice must be served. That's true. But very often I do think that, is a courtroom drama justice? Can you not see justice more as a democratic process? Sometimes I'm not so clear. Listening to the last session, people were talking, and the lawyer finally pointed out that criminal defamation should be sorted in the parliament and not in a courtroom. So there's a lot that can be sorted through dialogues, through discussion, truth and reconciliation. And yes, of course, justice have to be served.
All right.
President Nasheed, your tweet did raise a lot of controversy in India, not only in the journalistic community, but also in the strategic community and also among the policymakers. Now, that shows the importance of Nasheed in India. But there are certain problematic involved in that. One is to send a special envoy, the other is to send military force. Sending a military force is always fraught with extreme difficulties. We do not know what would be the mandate of this military force, what would be their mission objectives. If you were given 10 minutes to talk to the NSA, what would you tell him?
Well, what we are looking at is an interim arrangement that would take us to free and fair inclusive elections. And we are looking at reform of every single institution in the country. India has come into the Maldives. I'm not asking your troops to go to Malé and fight it out. I'm not asking for that. No one should get it wrong. I'm asking for an envoy backed by enough muscle so that President Yamin would listen to the envoy. I'm not even asking for regime change or in that sense. I'm asking for an envoy to have enough clout, and India will have the imagination and the tools to do that. I'm not a professional in these affairs, but I'm sure your professionals would know exactly how to do that. It's been done many times.
All right, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. We wish this instability comes to an end very soon, but imagining a situation that this comes to an end and elections are held. Okay, what is your permanent solution for a continuous democratic setup in Maldives? India is also interested to have democracy around the globe.
But see, India, the Maldives, democracy takes time to be entrenched. We can't do it overnight. And we will probably might go wrong again. But you have to keep at it. And until you finally get it right. I still don't see any other system of governance better than democracy, more sustainable than democracy. So I think we might do it wrong again, and we'll have to do it again. So it will take time, and it will take imagination, patience, and I am hopeful that maybe in our lifetime, hopefully in my lifetime, we would see an election circle, which we haven't seen yet. So the idea is to see an election circle. So that is why, it's difficult for me to see President Yamin to change the regime now. We must see an election circle.
Well, we've only seen it in Pakistan in the last few years, so it could take a while. There's a gentleman right at the back.
Yeah, Mr. Mohamed Nasheed, do you believe Maldives crisis could stir trouble between China and India?
Well, I thought that's what I was talking about.
Well, we have seen in the last few days statements made in Beijing, statements made in Male, and statements made in Delhi that seem to indicate that that there was almost a sense in Male and Beijing to threaten India not to take any action and certainly not to listen to your appeal. There were statements against what you said as well. Could Maldives become a flashpoint between India and China?
I think, I've been always saying that there is a Cold War brewing in the Indian Ocean. And we should be mindful about that. And we can't be sandwiched in between. And we must make sure that India's safety and national security, we must be mindful about that. Because we are just next door. And we can't suddenly be doing our own thing. Simply because someone decides to give me a few $1 million. It shouldn't work like that. And I hope that people in the Indian Ocean understands that this is not the way forward. We don't want India and China against each other, not at all. We do like China. There's nothing that I have nothing against China. All what we are saying is, do not attempt to change state type. Do not push your money in secrecy, have transparency, and have democratic oversight. And then things will fall into place. That's all. We're not asking for the sun, moon, and the stars.
Yes, sir. Just wait for the mic.
You said the extremists are eating society from within. Do you have any idea how they are doing it? Can you explain a bit? How is this being done?
People don't agree with me when I say that ISIS has a liberating philosophy as well. Well, in their worldview, they do have a liberating philosophy. And so it's difficult to see how any idea can take root without some element of liberation in it. So there is a lot of evangelism. There's a lot of conversion going on. There's a lot of sermons going on. There's an infrastructure being built. There are madrasas. There are people who go out to all sorts of schools and universities in both Pakistan and in Saudi Arabia. And they come back and they keep on propagating a very narrow version. So yes, it's very well thought out. It's a very long-term plan, and they do it inch by inch, millimeter by millimeter. And they would finally come to a position when they can move in and take over the state. And we've seen that done in many countries in the Middle East.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, I think... Oh, there's...
Well, I would like to ask you a question about impact on tourism footfalls after this.
Well, 30% of reservations have been cancelled in the last 2-3 days because we've declared martial law, and tourists wouldn't necessarily be very happy to come to a country that has just declared emergency rule. And also, it's difficult to get insurance when you have emergency rule. So there is big cancellations. And our government revenue would probably fall by about 40-50% this month. And we might not be able to pay civil servants next month.
There's a gentleman at the back. Oh, there's a lady here. Thank you. It's always nice to find one woman asking a question in the audience.
Thank you. My question is, why wasn't appeal made to China? And secondly, is China doing anything to establish stability in the region?
Well, you see, I can't see changing state type to be creating stability. So I don't see it. As long as you want to drive autocratic rule, if you want to prop up dictatorships, that doesn't necessarily stabilize a country.
But can't I ask, isn't that something the United States has done for decades around the world?
But it hasn't stabilized the world.
That's a fair point. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, sir. As you said, China holds 70% of Maldives' international debt. And with Maldives and other Indian Ocean countries agreeing to China's string of pearls, how do you think India will be able to protect the Indian Ocean countries now?
Well, if we let business as usual go, it's going to be difficult for India to data would be too late.
All right, you've made a very strong case for the challenges that you feel Maldives faces today, and a very strong appeal, if you like, for the international community to step in now. President Nasheed, former president of the Maldives, thank you so much for joining us here at the Huddle.
Thank you, Mr. Mohamed, Nasheed and Suhasini Haidar.